Now, if we look at clinical trials from the European perspective, as we mentioned in the previous module, clinical trial authorization in Europe is not a responsibility of the EMA. It is primarily a national competence. Using the European word, we would probably say here in the US, it's primarily a national responsibility. There is a European directive to help try to align and harmonize the requirements and the procedures across the various member states, and this is a work in progress. There is a new European directive that's been out for several years to try to address some of the challenges that were there in a previous version. But as we've mentioned, scientific advice, or otherwise meeting with the agency during the development process, is something that can happen both at the national level and at the European level. At the European level, it is coordinated by the European Medicines Agency, and the Scientific Advice Working Party is composed of technical experts from national regulatory authorities around the European Union and from national experts within academic sites and other institutions there in the European Union. Once they discuss with a company and make recommendations, those recommendations are submitted to the Committee for Medicinal Products for Human Use to get their thoughts and ultimately to get their agreement on what was in that particular advice. So how can you meet this challenge as a company? And again, I think whether you're in the US or in the European Union, it really, step one, is to know where you want to be at the end of this. Some people call this the company's golden package insert, using the US term, or the company's golden summary of product characteristics, or SPC, to use the European term. It's basically a document that envisions what you want the information about the product, what you want your package insert, what you want your SPC to say at the end of the development process. Now, chances are you clearly probably will not get exactly what's in there because the data are yet to be developed. But by knowing and having the vision, it allows a company to communicate much more effectively with the EU, EMA, and with the FDA as to their plans for their product, their vision for the product. Some people call this a TPP, or a targeted product profile. It really is a document that is a living document that is kind of the goalpost, the hoped for goalpost when one begins a development process. And it's a document that one continues to amend as you get data and greater knowledge about what this product can or perhaps cannot do. Obviously, step two is communication between the agency and the manufacturer. And in the United States, the question is, what is available for that kind of communication? Well, as we talked about last time, there is the law, there are the regulations, which are all public, and as we mentioned, these are all binding on both the manufacturer and the FDA. But below that line, things that are not binding are often just as helpful, if not more helpful, because they're often more contemporary, they're more in-depth, and they're more focused on the exact problem you're talking to the FDA about. These are the guidances that we mentioned last time, the FDA website, the public advisory committees, ad hoc phone calls that people have with FDA, and the thousands of FDA meetings each year that they have one-on-one with companies in order to discuss issues relating to the development and the use of their product in the United States. I think when you talk about this interchange and this activity between FDA and manufacturers, there really are three critical questions that any regulator who's involved in this kind of activity has to ask him or herself. And the first one is, how do you do this as a regulator without becoming too cozy with the manufacturer? And it kind of begs the question as to at what point has FDA or has EMA when they are involved in these kinds of meetings and giving scientific advice, I mean, at what point have they actually been co-opted into the development program such that someone might reasonably question whether it affects FDA's or EMA's ability to be objective at the end of this process, when they're going to be the institution that's responsible for looking at this development program and looking at the data and deciding whether indeed this product should be authorized. And I think in answer to this question, it goes to that last statement. They look at the development program and they look at the data. When they're having these meetings, they're talking about the development program. There is some data that comes into play, but one never has the entire data set until the full new drug application is submitted. So when FDA or EMA is doing its authorization review, it's looking at the data to decide whether indeed there is a positive benefit-risk profile. Prior to that, they're talking about the program, the development program, to develop those data. And as we've mentioned, I think from a public health perspective, the idea of patients and subjects being put into trials, large amounts of money being spent to run trials that don't give us good data at the end of the day, is not a good public health outcome. Now, know that I say to give us good data. It doesn't have to be data from a regulatory perspective that shows that the product should be approved. If it's data that shows that the product should not be approved, that's good data. You have to have interpretable data in order to make your regulatory decision. And that you don't have until the end. So working with companies to make sure that we have a development plan that will give us interpretable data is believed to be a good public health outcome that regulators should be involved in, and it is not a co-opting into a predetermined regulatory decision. The second question is whether FDA and EMA are perhaps a taxpayer-funded drug development consulting firm. And this is, again, I think is a very legitimate question, in that the money and the resources that are spent are in many respects often for product categories that we know a great deal about. There are people outside of FDA who can give that kind of advice. And I think FDA, when it agrees to a meeting, looks at it from the perspective of, is this advice that these people should be able to find an answer on the outside because it's a question that has been asked and answered previously? Or is this a new question? Is this something that's getting us into new technologies, new ways of doing something that we need to have a discussion between the regulator and the sponsor in order to develop the answers so that, again, the data are interpretable at the end? And then finally, how do you balance your review obligations and your meeting obligations? And this is something that FDA obviously has to always be thinking about when looking at the resources, the human resources that they have, because indeed it is the people that are meeting with the companies and giving the scientific advice on the development programs that are indeed the same people who are called upon to review applications that are coming in at the same time. So this is a management challenge, but it's one that FDA takes into account when it's looking at its budget, when it's looking at its staff, and it realizes that both of these are critical components, and it cannot choose to do one rather than the other. As I mentioned, the end of phase 2 is clearly a very important part of the end of phase 2 meeting is a very important meeting for all of the various reasons that you see here. And I just want to reiterate again that meeting to define a win, to define how does this product need to be characterized, what kind of data will be needed in order to support an indication or a dosing regimen, how any major safety concerns need to be addressed, and if there are any manufacturing issues, how those need to be addressed during phase 3 so that, again, a complete interpretable NDA, quality NDA, can be submitted to FDA at the end of the development program. There is in the United States also an ability to deal with what are called special protocols. These are 3 kinds of protocols that FDA will meet with manufacturers on to discuss specifics, and that FDA will agree to be bound by the advice that it gives. This is on a carcinogenicity protocol, on a stability protocol, and on a phase 3 clinical trial that will be the primary data for an efficacy claim. Basically, the written agreements here, as I mentioned, are binding, except obviously if the scientific knowledge changes from the time FDA gave its advice to when the application comes in, using this particular trial as the data to support the indication they're looking for. There are in the United States also some things that are called early access initiatives, and I've tried to portray these here, and I will briefly highlight some of these because you could spend hours talking about each and every one of these. But these are things you will hear about, and I think it's important to understand what they mean, and to also, as you'll see in a subsequent slide, how once again you find the same English language term is used one way in the United States, and it means the same term means something different in the European context. Well, let's start down in the lower right-hand corner here with priority review, because this is one of the oldest early access initiatives, as it were, that FDA has. When a new drug application is submitted, FDA will make a decision on whether that application should have a standard review or a priority review. If the FDA believes that the product has the potential to offer something new to the armamentarium, that it's addressing a question that there are not other products out there for, the product will be assigned a priority review, meaning that FDA has to complete its review and either authorize the product or give the manufacturer a complete response letter with all of the deficiencies within 6 months. If the product is not judged to be worthy of a priority review, then it will default to a standard review where FDA has to do the complete review in 10 months. So that's what priority review means down in that corner. An accelerated approval, as you see in the upper right-hand corner, is an early access initiative that really grew out of the early HIV/AIDS epidemic in the United States in the early 1990s. This was when you had a situation where a community was telling FDA that because of the, in essence, death sentence that they had at that point in time, that they were clearly willing to tolerate certain risks that perhaps in other situations patients and practitioners would not be willing to tolerate. For example, the risk of not knowing perhaps everything about the efficacy of a drug that you might want to know, or perhaps not having the same amount of safety data on the product as you might want at that point. But the community is saying, we're willing to take those risks because of the incredible risk that we know we are taking with the disease that we have. And so FDA developed an accelerated approval program which allows a product to be authorized based on what we call an unvalidated surrogate. In other words, instead of having to do the clinical trial all the way to the point where you've shown that the product actually had a clinical benefit, it either prolonged life or it cut down on the incidence of a comorbidity. This particular program allowed an authorization based on a surrogate that was thought to be reasonably predictive of clinical benefit, but which at that point in time had not been shown to actually be predictive of clinical benefit. In the early HIV experience, for example, looking at what were called CD4 counts, this was a lab value, and people believed strongly that if you had a product that showed that you had a positive effect on CD4 counts, that people with HIV/AIDS would live longer and would have fewer opportunistic infections. But that at that point in time was a belief. It had not been absolutely established. But FDA, in discussion with the community, was willing to approve products that showed at that point in time that they had a positive effect on this unvalidated surrogate lab endpoint, with the proviso that the trials would continue on to either validate that surrogate endpoint or show that the belief was unfounded. Well, as you all know, the belief was validated, and because of the accelerated approval program, people in the community were able to access this product much earlier than they would have been had the FDA said, no, we're going to do as normal and wait until we show an actual clinical benefit from the particular product. FDA has used this in other diseases other than HIV/AIDS, but the basic tenet of the program is what I just explained to you. Fast Track rolling review at the bottom is another initiative that FDA has where for certain products that are indeed products that offer something very, very new and that are bringing to a patient population that has a serious life-threatening disease for which there are no other therapies, FDA is willing to work with the company in a way that as they are developing their data, instead of having to keep it all together and then put it together at the end into an NDA and submit it, they're allowed to do what we call a rolling review, that they submit their data at the end of phase 1, they submit at the end of phase 2, so that basically FDA is reviewing the data as they are developing it, so that when you get to the development, at the end of the development that is agreed, FDA only has to review the last piece coming in, which clearly expedites the review process at that point in time. Just to give you a little bit on the nomenclature comparison here, the term we use for priority review that I just explained a few minutes ago, you will hear in Europe the term fast track used. And this is the one that's most confusing because, as we just mentioned, if you look down here, fast track in the United States means this rolling review, which there really is no equivalent to in the European system. When you hear someone talking about a fast track in the European system, they're basically talking about the same thing as a priority review in the United States. What we call accelerated approval in the United States is very similar to what the Europeans have under their conditional approval. And we have something called Subpart E that basically allows a product, because of the need for the product, to be approved when it shows efficacy demonstrably at the end of phase 2, but it doesn't have a really large safety database. The Europeans have the same kind of a program, but they call it approval under special circumstances. So again, to give you this feeling that what the FDA does and what the European system does are often the same thing based on the same principles, trying to get to the same outcome, but some of the confusion comes in the nomenclature that we use, and often when we use these same English language terms to mean different things. There's also a little bit of a difference when you look at what happens in the review process in the United States versus the review process in Europe. And this is a very high-level, kind of broad paintbrush approach here. But in the US system, basically when the NDA comes in, it is divided up and it's sent to expert reviewers within FDA in the various components. So in the manufacturing, in clinical, in statistics, in toxicology, in pharmacology. And these reviewers review the data very much in depth until it's all done, and then it's brought together towards the end of the review period. And often there is a more of a consensus building process within the FDA and in using an advisory committee in many situations to get a much more of a consensus view on what these data are showing us. In the European system, on the other hand, there is a much shorter period that is spent in the in-depth review of the data, which is done by reviewers in 2 different member states that are selected to do it. They have about 70 days to do that first review, and then there is a consensus building, a discussion that occurs at CHMP that by the end of 120 days will then give a list of questions that the manufacturer is required to respond to. There is, again, as you see there in the gray, a period where the reviewers within the European system look at those responses, and then again there is a longer period with the CHMP to discuss more broadly and to build more of a consensus around the interpretation of those data. So even though the time frames from the initial submission of the marketing application to making a decision is very similar in the European system and the US system, kind of actually what happens when you look at the amount of time spent on in-depth data review and the amount of time spent on a broader discussion of the data and a more consensus building kind of activity, you see what one has in a network of trying to bring together the viewpoints and the medical system and cultures in a large number of countries versus a more unified medical system and medical culture that we have in the United States. It's obviously reflected in kind of how this process goes forward.